So in the second part of the course introduction for Faith and Culture, we ask the question, what is worldview? And this is a term that is not without some controversy, used without some controversy. Some people think the term is overused. Others think that perhaps it's a little bit too mechanical. But it's one way of coming to understand how culture functions. And so the basics of how we view the world and interact with the world in which we live is how we see the world, and that's where the term worldview comes from. James Sire, who has written extensively on the Christian worldview in particular, he's the author of the book The Universe Next Door, which is a book that's been used sort of as a definitive identifier of the Christian worldview. And this book has been used by universities all over the world, literally. I think it's in its fourth printing. But in his recent book, small little book put out by University Press entitled Naming the Elephant, he starts out with a story of a little boy who comes in and asks his dad, it's a little boy who heard in science class that the Earth is a globe floating through space, and he just couldn't make any sense of that. And so he comes in and says, Dad, what holds up the world? And well, his dad is just busy as he can be, doesn't have time to explain things. So at first he says, son, it's a camel. And the little boy thinks, okay, camel's pretty big, I guess that would work. And he's out playing with his friends in the backyard, and he waits, and he thinks, and it hits him. Wait, that doesn't work. So he comes back in and says, Dad, what holds up the world? What holds up the camel? And his dad says a kangaroo. Anyway, you get the idea. The dad just keeps putting him off. Finally, his son comes back in, asks again, and his dad said, look, it's an elephant all the way down. Now, that same little boy comes in and asks his father, who this time, let's say, is a scientist. And so this time the father says, well, the way the Earth floats through space is because of the law of gravity, and he talks to him about force and the mass of planets and the relationship of mass of planets, and he knows everything there is to know about space. But the point is, the little boy could still ask him, how do you know that's true? Because while the one had an uninformed worldview and the other had an informed worldview, both of those are based on presuppositions. How do you know that the universe is uniform? Which is the basic presupposition of any kind of setting up any kind of sort of law of gravity, formulaic understanding of the universe. Both answers, again, are based on presuppositions. And presuppositions can be are basic commitments that we believe to be true. And they can either be informed and consistent, therefore we call them theoretical. So here are commitments that have been carefully studied out. Or they can be uninformed and unorganized, and these are non-theoretical presuppositions. And what happens is, if we have basic presuppositions that somehow are proven wrong, then that becomes very problematic in terms of continuing to support a particular way of looking at the world. So a worldview is a fundamental perspective from which one addresses every issue of life. And so, in a more complete definition of worldview, listen to how this functions, and particularly listen to how it seems to be a functional equivalent of the word faith. And this goes back to what we talked about in our first discussion together, that everybody has a system of faith in something. So a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story, narrative, or in a set of presuppositions, which we hold consistently or inconsistently about the basic constitution of reality. And that provides a foundation upon which we live and move, and have our being. This is the function of worldview. So, in a sense, now this is the adventure that we're on right now that I want you to think about in this course. Now, if there were one thing that I could say, let's think about this as we continue our study together, it's the idea that we are all involved in co-creating our worldview. Now, I mentioned something about this in our first lecture, that there are givens over which we have no control or input. That there are things about our life that have been given to us, and we simply respond out of that. But while this is ubiquitous, it's also provisional. That is, it's influenced by one's noetic structure at every moment. We're constantly having input into how we see the world. And our world view changes as we receive new information. So whether we recognize this or not, this is a process that's constantly going on in our mind. It saturates everything, and it's also changing as we have new experiences. So it's formed by our life experience and our learning environment, and that all becomes another part of our noetic structure. By the way, a noetic structure is simply every event that's ever occurred in your life, whether you know it or not. It's stored in a memory bank somewhere, and it's affecting you. And you are organizing your thoughts according to this structure that you have created, so that as you see certain things, you respond to those in certain ways. And we learn about life as we experience life, and it changes the way we see those things, which are currently happening around us. So our worldview is made up both of theoretical and non-theoretical presuppositions. So we ask the question, what is the real story? And I can only answer the question, what am I going to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story do I find myself a part? And this is a famous quote of MacIntyre, a well-known philosopher. In other words, I can't know how to behave if I don't know the story in which I am behaving. So the way that we understand human life depends on what conception we have of the human story. What is the real story of which my story is a part? And this is Leslie Newbigin, who in very many ways is sort of the father of what I would call narrative theology in today's world, and that is understanding our relationship to God in the context of a story. Now, one of the things about worldview that's very interesting is that there is a communal nature to it. It is shared by community, and this is what we know as prevailing culture. And so in our first formal lecture after the introduction, the title of that lecture, if you look in your syllabus, is called Culture's Function and Impact and Forming a Consistent Worldview. And so what we're going to try to do is to look at tools and definitions and understanding so that we can understand culture as we encounter it. And so one's worldview in community is what forms the prevailing culture of a particular area. And so there are issues in a communal way of life that are defined and experienced. And this communal way of seeing the world shapes and unifies communal life. It's socialized into this communal life. And often this is unconscious. It's done simply because it's the way that a particular culture or a particular group of people see the world. And there doesn't have to be intentionality to it. It happens by itself. And it shapes the whole of our lives. So we have these storied visions of and for life in community. And it shapes the way that we see the world, the way that we interpret the world, the way that we live in the world. And we act out of our basic beliefs. This is what we call memory learning and not thinking learning. Now, one of the things that I think you'll find really interesting about this whole discussion is that this allows us to understand why we have the kind of reactions we sometimes have, and how we can have ideas that are so remarkably different from people who perhaps seem to be very similar to us. But depending on our sociological grouping, the way that we see an event in the world and interpret an event in the world may well be determined by the sort of cultural, communal worldview, which is specific to the group that most influences us. And this idea of acting out of our memory learning and not our thinking learning is a really important idea that educators are now just coming to terms with. That just because we have rote memory does not mean we actually learn skills. There's one thing to have information in our frontal lobe where processing takes place. It's another thing to have it deeper in the other parts of our mind where through habitual learning it's become a part of who we are. And so this is what we're talking about in terms of habitual learning and the deep way in which we see things and experience things in our life. Now, this lecture will be very brief, but I do want you to consider several elements of worldview. I'd like you to write these down. I would like you to define your understanding of these particular elements that make up your worldview. And then at the end of the course, we'll look at them again and we'll see if there have been any changes that have occurred in the way that you see the world. But when we talk about all these various elements, it takes on the form of a grand story. It will all fit together in some kind of a coherent sense of story, and the fundamental beliefs are embedded into that grand story. It's rooted in religious faith commitment. Now, you could say, okay, then this would exclude anyone who is not a religious person. Well, the way that religion is used in the idea of religious faith commitment here, it's talking about whatever commitment you have toward that which you believe most. And so everyone would be included in this. It has a communal nature. It shapes the whole of our lives, and all have a worldview, but very few articulate it. So the purpose of this course is to give us an opportunity to say, this is what I believe and why. So here they are. There are 6 basic questions that I want you to consider. Now, I've seen lists with as many as 10. Some have even more than that in terms of basic elements. But I'd like to boil them down into these questions. The first is the only one that is chronological, meaning it needs to be first. It's the one of primary importance. The rest could follow in any particular sequence. But it's a question of prime reality. And if I ask you the question, what is your basic understanding of reality? No human being is neutral with regard to God. So this is a question of theology. And the issue is central. And we need to encourage people to dig below the surface and uncover their basic philosophical and religious presuppositions. All worldviews begin, okay, again, we're talking about the fundamental first thing of a worldview is theology. It's either theology, the existence of God, or a theology, meaning no God. So prime reality either exists in a God or in nature itself. So this is also a question of ontology. And that is, what is real? If the basis of our understanding of life is God, then who is our God? Is he personal, knowable? If he's knowable, how do we know him? And what is our view of God? So when we ask the question of prime reality, this includes a lot of material that's really important and basic to the way that we see the world. So in other words, the first question, do you believe there is a God? If no, then what takes the place of that God? What is the mechanical function? How did the world get here, etc.? If you do believe in God, then identify who that God is, how you believe he reveals himself, how he functions. This is that first question of prime reality. Then another element of worldview is metaphysics, and that is, what is the nature of the external reality around us? This is an understanding of ultimate reality as well, but this aspect has to ask the question, what is the relationship between God and the universe? Is the universe eternal? Is there anything outside of physics? Metaphysics literally means that which is beyond physics. So if you are a naturalist and you believe there is no God and everything has just simply happened as a result of chance, then that's a closed universe. There can be no ultimate meaning in that universe. But if there's a personal, eternal, omnipotent God who created the world, then this asks the question, how does that God interact with the world? Is it a world? Is it a mechanistic object that runs independently of God? Is there a purpose to our existence on this globe? And so the second question for our worldview is that of metaphysics. How do we see this sort of dynamics of life, if you will? Then the question of anthropology, and this can be broken down into several different questions, but it's basically your view of humanity. This is not often discussed as an element of your worldview, but it's absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the world. Are human beings free? Is there such thing as personal freedom? What's the effect of Adam's sin on us? Are we depraved? Are we basically good? Are we merely pawns of deterministic forces? Are we merely physical beings? And then the question of eschatology, that is, what happens at death? The study of the end of times, if you will. This is a question of vision. What do you see as the direction of the purpose of your life? All of us have a sense of things the way that things should be. Do we think that the world is working toward that ultimate good? Is there any purpose in life at all? And so the idea of the end times, or is history moving towards something? Then here we find ourselves in a learning environment called a university, so epistemology is central to that. That's just simply your understanding of knowledge. And why do you want to know more? And who do you believe ultimately is telling the truth? And how can you discover what is truth? Can God reveal himself to humankind? Can he reveal information to humankind? So epistemology is our understanding of knowledge, why we pursue it, and ultimately what we believe to be true. And ethics, this one I think you understand this. It doesn't take a lot of explanation. It's just basically, how do you know to do what is right and wrong? You make decisions all the time based on what criteria? And so this is asking us the question, do we believe that there is some value in life for which then we ought to make all of our decisions through that particular value? Then the question of human history, and you could say, well, is this not very similar to eschatology? Well, I suppose so, but it has more to do with the idea of how human history is moving. While it's similar to eschatology, it's also wider. What do you see as the purpose of existence? Is there any meaning in history? Is there any meaning in living in the present time? Is there any purpose beyond our understanding of good? And this question of personal vision, I mentioned this in the first lecture under this idea of, well, Kyle Idleman mentions it in his spiritual arteriogram when he asks about what our dreams are. This one's really important. And it is, if you could envision yourself, let's say 10 years from now, doing exactly what you would dream that you were doing, what would be the perfect life for you? Describe what you imagine as the good life. Because this will tell you a lot about how you see the world. See, I've had a lot of past students who at this point have figured out how they think I want them to answer the questions of worldview. So when I ask them about prime reality, they'll use wonderful language to talk about an omnipotent God who is omnipresent and amazing. And then when they write about metaphysics, they believe that God speaks to them and has a purpose for their life. And they believe that it's all working toward an eschatological renewal, new creation. And their pursuit of God, and it changes the way they see knowledge, that they want to know more so they can glorify God more fully. And you ask them about their ethics. They want to do everything they can to promote the purposes of God. And well, what is humankind? Well, nothing apart from God. And so they seem to have all these wonderful answers. But then when it comes to what is your vision, in 10 years they'd like to have a really nice house, 2 cars, a beautiful spouse, 2 to 4 children. 4 is too many now, 2 children, and a white picket fence. And you recognize their vision is the American dream, not necessarily God's dream. And so this question of personal vision will sometimes expose our worldview for what it is. It's not exactly what we say it is. It's rather focused on materialism. Now, Jesus spoke directly about the importance of worldview when he said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Now, what we need to understand with this is when Jesus talks about heaven, he's not talking about what we in our culture think about in terms of heaven. It's not about laying up for ourselves treasures in this distant place so that someday we'll have those treasures to spend again. Jesus is talking about the dwelling place of God. And for the Hebrew, it would have been around us. So in other words, he's saying, don't invest yourself in a physical life where you can't protect what you have, but rather live out the ways of God in such a way that the treasures that you accumulate will always be there and cannot be taken away. So it's a different way of seeing the world. And then he goes on to say the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Here, I think Jesus is specifically talking about worldview. That your worldview is the lamp of your life. And if your worldview is healthy, all of your life is going to be full of light. But if you have a distorted worldview, that means everything you see, you're seeing through the distorted lens of some story that ultimately is going to bring ruin. And so no one can serve 2 masters, for either one will hate the one, love the other, or will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money, and really the word that's used there means more than money. It means a system of thinking that ultimate value can be found in the accumulation of things. And those are competing faith systems. We can't do both of those. So what I want us to think about, and we'll deal more with this in the first unit of study in this course, but as we consider our own lives and that which we're spending the economy of our life into, and what I mean by that is you have limited resources that are available to you, and some of those resources you don't often think about, one of which is your own time. How do you spend your time? Into what value do you give your time? So how do you spend your time? How do you spend your money? How do you spend your emotions? All of that exposes ultimately what you believe to be true. And so if you ask those questions, what is my view of prime reality? What is my view of metaphysics? Does God interact in my life? Do I live in a meaningless, closed universe? What's my view of anthropology? What is the capability of humankind? And when it comes to things like eschatology, do I think there's meaning? Are things moving in a particular direction? And let me go ahead and include history in there. Does history itself have meaning? Does life as I'm presently living it, is there meaning there? And if so, what is that? Or what about knowledge itself? What is my view of epistemology? Do I think that there's meaning there? And then do I make choices that are consistent with that which would honor God? And then ultimately, what is it that I want out of life? Because whatever it is that I desperately want, that's where my heart's going to be. And what I want to challenge, I know I'm talking to people who are at different places in life, but I want to challenge you to think about what you value most, and then to ask yourself, does that give my life the meaning that makes my life worth living? And I think you're going to find this a useful study. I hope that you do. Again, do not hesitate to give me your feedback on any of this. You will have questions that accompany every lecture that I make, and those questions will be answered in different contexts. Some of your courses will choose to use those as threaded discussions that you'll do online. Others, you'll be talking about these questions among yourself. But I'm very interested in your feedback and want to know how I can make this a better study. And so I think this will serve well as an introduction into the next lecture, which is talking about culture itself, how it functions, and what it means to form a consistent worldview within that. Then, after that, we will take a look at the idea of what I think Scripture teaches in terms of a Christian worldview. And we'll move on with the study then from there.